Well, hello and welcome to the Research Centre today from the Gardens, Libraries and Museums at the University of Oxford, and a particular welcome to anyone who's joining us from outside Oxford. My name is Sheila Van Kerend. I'm Curator of Chinese Art at the Ashmolean, and I'm convening this seminar on behalf of the Department of Eastern Art. I'm delighted to introduce our speaker today, Angelamaria Aceto, who's Research Assistant on the Italian Drawings Project in the Department of Western Art, and there will be the opportunity at the end of her presentation to put questions to her through the chat. As research assistant on the Italian Drawings Project, Angelamaria coordinated the various elements of the project, as well as researching drawings across the collection. She's particularly focused on the remarkable and underexplored collection of architectural and ornamental drawings from the 15th to the 18th centuries, which led to new findings and to the preparation of various articles. She's continued to work on Raphael, contributing to the 2020 celebrations of the 500th anniversary of the artist's death with international papers, a forthcoming essay, and a collaboration on the major 500th anniversary exhibition project in Rome, Raphael 1483 to 1520. The Ashmoleans lent to that exhibition, and Angelamaria has co-authored a catalogue essay, and she's written several of the catalogue entries. And today she's going to share with us some of the new research and discoveries that are related to the project. Welcome, Angelamaria.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for having me today. So I will now share the screen. So I will just structure the presentation into parts. I will very briefly introduce the collection just for those who are less familiar with the Ashmolean and its collection, and I will then focus on very much a handful of drawings, which will give me the opportunity to address broader questions about Raphael, as well as present some new recent discoveries. Raphael's drawings collection at the Ashmolean Museum lies at the very heart of the museum as you know it today, of its history and identity. If in a way you imagine the visitor walking through the building, the neoclassical building, which opened in 1845 on Beaumont Street, the Charles Cockerell building, there were essentially three main groups of three main collections that could be enjoyed. The Randall marbles, of course, which you can still see today as you on your left-hand side as you step into the museum, a collection of paintings which was transferred from the Bodleian Library, and above all, a collection of drawings by Michelangelo and Raphael, which was rotated in the gallery on the first floor, called after Raphael, in fact, at the time, which, just to put things into context, is the room where you can see today the great masterpieces, Paoluccello, Piero di Cosimo, so the Italian, the paintings collection, the Renaissance paintings collection. The drawings by Michelangelo Raphael had belonged to the great portrait painter Thomas Lawrence, who, as well as being a leading portraitist, was a very refined, discerned drawing collector. Just for fun, I've included a drawing at the top right, just a very chubby leg of a child that really echoes some of the drawings by Leonardo and Raphael himself that he must have been very familiar with. I'm not going to go into the very complex story of the dispersal of this collection. I shall just very briefly say that Lawrence died in 1830, and it took 12 years for the collection finally to be acquired by the Ashmolean Museum by public subscription. As a result, the Ashmolean houses a very important collection of Michelangelo's drawings, and very much without exaggerations, the most important collection of Raphael's drawings in the world. It's a very extraordinary collection because, well, first, it's a large corpus, many school drawings, but 80 solidly attributable to Raphael, one more, one less, depending who you're talking to. But is a collection that is very varied. It really shows you Raphael as a complex draftsman, so the different uses, functions, a great variety of material, the medium. But above all, I would say it's a collection that really allows you to follow Raphael's career from the very beginning to the very end. So whether or not you think this is an example of his early, of 1497, or perhaps earlier when Raphael was just an adolescent, we do have examples which show how he, by the late 1490s, for example, he had absorbed and I would say already overtaken, at least in drawing, Raphael Pietro Perugino's vocabulary in this beautiful metal point study for 2 soldiers in the center. Or even more interestingly, we see him in this very lively, creative drawing, metal point drawing on the right-hand side, working in fact for a senior master, Bernardo Pinturicchio, who had been the recipient of a major commission in Siena and the Cathedral of Siena, and yet he goes to a younger master, Raphael, to ask him to provide finished cartoons, one-to-one drawing. So Raphael is already acknowledged in around 1502 as a great designer. And we follow him in Florence, where he probably arrived in 1504, although he must have visited the city beforehand. And we see him in this very, very important drawing as he responds to the old masters of the time in this drawing, where he emulates Donatello, which I'm showing you as it would have been seen by Raphael in a niche of Orsa Michele in Florence. And obviously here is already absorbing the antique in this very, a figure like this, such an elegant nude with this elegant contrapposto would have been unthinkable without the knowledge of classical antiquity. And of course, we see him in action in the center as a painter of Sacred Family. He became a very successful painter of Sacred Family in his luminous compositional study for the Virgin of the Meadow, a beautiful pen and wash, very painterly study in the center. And of course, we see him in action as he competes with the senior master Michelangelo and Leonardo, who at the beginning of the century had painted 2 revolutionary frescoes celebrating 2 medieval Florentine battles, where they very much challenged and pushed the boundaries of the theme of the male nude emotion, which had been a central concern very much for Florentine artists since the previous century. And this is possibly one of the reasons why Raphael decided to go to Florence very much to study what in fact became, you're looking at the Battle of Cascina here in a copy, but it became essentially a textbook for a generation of artists. And of course, we follow him in Rome, where he'll be working for 2 great popes, in fact, 2 of the main popes of the history of the church. I've known Julius II, Leo X. He became very much the interpreter of Julius II, ambitious project of a renovatio imperio, renovating the imperial Rome. And we see him working in his private rooms, in fact in the Apostolic Palace, at the same time as Michelangelo was painting the Sistine Chapel. So a very exciting time to be in Rome, and the popes were the patrons you wanted to work for. As he thinks of the disputation of the Holy Sacrament in this very early study, again, compositional study in pen and wash, again, very much a reflection on light and shade. And later on, in these very different drawing, chalk drawing, study of anatomical study for these two struggling soldiers in the Battle of Constantine against Maxentia and the Saga di Costantino. So we're around 1519, a section of the Apostolic Palace that he never completed. And you see him how he's exploiting the chalk very much to carve the figure in a way. Chalk is very tactile, is using a little bit of white, and the effect is very sculptural. And obviously, you know, it could have had a male nude in front of him posing, but Raphael always filters what is looking at the surrounding world through his very, very deep knowledge of classical antiquity. And I've added this relief here, which is a nice comparison, which a colleague, Vincenzo Farinella, very appropriately made recently. There seems to be, you know, it seems that Raphael is not copying, of course, but sort of remembering this Neo-Attic relief. And obviously, I'm not going to talk about this drawing. There is a wonderful entry by Ben Thomas in the exhibition catalogue of 2017. But just to say, this is the drawing of all the drawings, arguably the most beautiful drawings in the world, made in connection with the Transfiguration on altarpiece that Raphael never completed, but we have several drawings. One of the most beautiful is here at the Ashmolean, and obviously a drawing that is much more than a preparatory drawing, as the exhibition I've just mentioned at the Ashmolean of 2017 convincingly argued. So a selection of 50 drawings was very much protagonist of a major exhibition, the Ashmolean, organized in 2017, and it was created by Catherine Whistler Ben Thomas, and I was very privileged to participate, to take part as a research assistant. So 2 years which have been pivotal in sort of developing the further discoveries I'll be talking to you today. And in part, I will also include some of the sort of discoveries that I've made recently, working on the Scuderia del Quirinale exhibition, where I co-authored an essay with Professor Francesco Paolo Di Teodoro. And the Oxford Research Project behind the show essentially argued for a shift in the way we approach Raphael's drawings. Traditionally, scholars have sort of interrogated, consumed his drawings primarily as a visual documents, which aids essentially us in our understanding of a finished work. So it's a stepping stone towards a finished work of art, whether it is a print or a painting, a piece of architecture, and so on. And this is, of course, extremely important. This is, you know, essential, and drawing notably gives us very much an insight into the artist's creative mind. But the risk is that sort of one loses sight on one hand on what drawing is more broadly, and drawing is a cognitive tool whereby the artist appropriates the surrounding world, is a place for intimate reflection, and it can indeed be an autonomous activity, something again that the exhibition successfully argued. And this is on one hand. On the other hand, but the 2 points are complementary, and this is the strand I will particularly insist on today. One loses sight of the material aspects of drawings, okay? What material is the artist using? How is it using it? What can the paper, the support, tell us? And so we were, throughout the process, we collaborated very closely with our paper conservators, who already number, so because there is a lot that our human eye can do by itself with with aid of simple tools, but it's just not enough. We need the support of more sophisticated tools, and this is something that has been generally understood forever for paintings, but less so for drawings. And so our paper conservators already a number of years before had begun sort of looking very closely at a selection of our drawings, documenting, and neither of these two drawings I'm showing now were included in the exhibition, but they're just very significant because they really show you, for example, what a simple picture in transmitted light can do. So you literally take a piece of paper, you put it against a strong source of light, and all of a sudden the structure of the paper becomes visible. The ley line, the chain lines, the watermarks, the repairs, you can see how the ink has eaten through the paper. And here something very important, incredible work our paper conservators have done. They've taken the measurements of the chain lines, which actually can become very useful to the art historical discourse, and actually we will see an example in a little while. Just to say, this is of course, I said, this is relatively new for drawing scholarship. This approach is attention to the materiality of drawings, and I've just taken a picture of a selection of books that I had at home, which I'd like to acknowledge. I think it's fair to say that this approach is actually very, very new for Raphael specifically, apart from a few case studies. There hasn't been, I always say, sufficient to think that we don't have a catalogue. I'm not saying a complete catalogue, but a substantial catalogue of Raphael watermarks. There has been one produced for Michelangelo, for example. There has been loads of work done for Leonardo, but for Raphael, still nothing. And so my objective today is to show you what actually, how much essentially we can learn by really through a sort of painstaking attention to details on the drawing, by interrogating the drawing in its complexity, by thinking of the drawing. I know some of my paper conservators colleagues may not agree, as a three-dimensional object, I'd like to do so with one of the most exciting discoveries I've made recently, which essentially concerns this drawing, very, very important drawing made in connection with the Disputa in the Stanze Vaticane. So we are looking, just to clarify, you're looking at two sides of one object, recto, verso, back and front. On the recto, so to speak, there's this wonderful tactile drapery study. Essentially, Raphael is thinking about this figure in the Transfiguration, very beautifully drawn by using charcoal, black chalk, a little bit of white. And then he turns the paper and he thinks a little bit more about the figure. At this time, he's still with black chalk. He's focusing on the gesture. And then what we see is that Raphael, after some distance, whether after half an hour or 2 days, we don't know, but he picks up pen and ink and starts drawing a sonnet, starts writing a sonnet. This is, I should say, this is an extremely important drawing, not least because it's one of 5 sheets carrying, in fact, an example of Raphael's poetry. Raphael enjoyed himself. It was a hobby very much, like many of his contemporaries. He enjoyed writing verses in Petrarchan style. And it seems very much that in the same session he drew this beautiful sensuous woman who seems to be sitting on clouds. The function of this particular drawing is, to me, still a little bit problematic, but I won't talk specifically about this. the point is that if you look very closely and you focus on the top section, you start seeing, and I'll point with my mouse now, some gray lines. Here, most interesting, you can see actually an arch that runs all around this area, and a few marks here and around here. So if you then take some breaking light, you can clearly see that there is a drawing. And what I'm showing here, in fact, is a RTI, so a very high resolution image taken with a very sophisticated machine, which paper conservators operate, which really pulls out the stratigraphy. In particular, it has made the drawing in blind stylus very, very evident. So blind stylus is just to introduce as a tool. It's essentially a technique whereby the artist engraves the paper by using a blunt point, which you literally engraves, it leaves a mark, an indentation, but not a visible mark. Although if you use a metal stylus, you can see that sometimes a few residues of lead point can be left behind. And so you can see the arch very clearly. You start seeing something a little bit clearly. There's a sort of arm. There are other marks here. And so what I've done here, I've sort of, I went over the marks to allow better legibility. And all of a sudden, we have new sketches which I think can be quite solidly connected to the top section of the dispute around the Holy Sacrament study. So we can add it to one of to the handful of drawings we have for this section for the angels, and we can easily, we can confidently do that by comparison with a drawing in the Ashmolean Museum, which I'm showing you here on the right hand side. And this comparison with a drawing at the British Museum actually is even more eloquent. It's particularly what is particularly eloquent is this arch, which marks the very top of the heavenly semicircle, and sort of the relation of the figure with the arch here as well. And what it seems that is happening in these sketches is that Raphael is essentially thinking of the angels as at some point not full length as you see them in the final painting, but as a sort of emerging from clouds. You can see how it's nicely drawn, the clouds here that correspond very nicely to the painting. And this is something that Robinson said back in 1870. Robinson, one of the early Raphael scholars, in connection to art drawing, but he didn't notice that in fact here as well. I hope you have a big screen in front of you, because here this is not the best RTI, but I can promise that here the angels are full length. In fact, he's drawn the figures full length. There are again legs in blind stylus, but nevertheless the discovery of this little drawing seems very much to confirm what Robinson was thinking. Now you think that this is it, but actually there is more happening. And if you go down and you focus on this section, you can clearly see a other blind stylus marks, what it seems in fact a profile with an ear, and other marks which seems apparently to refer simply to this beautiful female figure. So it looks like Raphael, as he often does after all, is sort of loosening up his hand, his mind, before picking up an indelible medium, which is pen and ink. But in fact, what this figure is, and we couldn't see it clearly until we did a proper RTI, is a figure to which Parker refers, which I went over. It's this, which he calls a stepping male, drawn in stylus. Parker, I should say that Katie Parker was the great keeper who catalogued all our drawings here at the Ashmolean in the 1950s. And so we often, you will hear about him often during this presentation, and so Beckett mentioned this figure, but then he could not really comment on the function. He can say because essentially he had not noticed the upper sketches, but in the light of what we found now at the very top, we can confidently state that this is yet another study for the angels in the Disputa. Again, we can clarify the function of these invisible drawings, so to speak. But Raphael, again, is still there, is still thinking, is restless, and so his thoughts go from one side of, from one detail to the other, from top to bottom. He's really brainstorming on this piece of paper. And what he does, still with a blind stylus in his hand, he pulls out the shape of the female figure. You can see that I've only traced the stepping male, but I left untraced some of the lines. You can see this line around the head, a line around the leg, which essentially refer to her. So with great economy of means, by reusing what he has already on the piece of paper, he pulls out, as I said, in stylus, the female figure, and then finally fixes her with pen and ink. And what you see happening here is, in a way, there is a sort of metamorphosis of forms. He is very similar to what he does in another drawing at the Albertina, where he's thinking of the judgment of Solomon, and he first draws the soldier here. This is the profile, and then he transforms him in the mother. You can see her. Now this her profile, and then the drapery. So the drawing very much of trying to superimpose these are my tracings superimposed onto the verso, but just to show you, you know, the drawings are not necessarily what we think they are. You know, it's always you know, they're real. I use the word, the expression palimpsest, and it is very much the case. And this is a case study that really gives you an insight into Raphael's stratigraphic approach to drawing, and as well as showing you that you know, new sketches can indeed come out. I will move on to a different topic. This is Raphael collecting and the archaeology of drawings, and I will do so with these two very nice and important drawings at the Ashmolean Museum. Two important drawings because they are among they're in fact the only surviving preparatory drawings for the Madonna del Cardellino, a painting at the Uffizi, highly repainted because it was damaged in a fire, but nevertheless a very important document of Raphael's activity in Florence. And as you can imagine, his drawings have been in the literature several times. So this is again the recto. And now I will move on to the verso. So again, you're looking at two sides of the same drawing. And what you see on the verso, essentially, so you have a picture here in natural light, and here you see a picture in transmitted light, because the verso is covered up with a backing, and so the only way to unveil the versus is to, as I said, put this drawing on against a strong source of light. And these are actually, I realize these are not everyone's cup of tea, not particularly exciting, but I can reassure they are actually very exciting, because they're among the very few examples of Raphael's architectural drawings. Raphael has been, as an architect, has been highly influential in the Western world, and yet very, very few visual documents, very few drawings have survived of him as an artist, as a draftsman. So this is another slide which shows you both images in transmitted light. You can see that here there's a lovely watermark that has been highlighted, and what I'm sure you can see clearly is later restoration, very, very nicely done. In fact, whoever did it used laid paper, and you can barely, if you look at the drawings and the natural light, we can go back, you can actually just barely notice it. And it was by looking at these sort of two images, in fact, not so much looking at these two pictures, but was looking at the photographs, black and white reproductions, where the contrast was particularly strong, that I thought that this way the sheets were cut, it was very peculiar. They're sort of silhouetted in a serpentine way. Oh, this is just to show you that once you get rid of a sort of fun and stroke sad image, because it shows you what happens once you get rid of the restoration. So the drawing was actually disfigured, especially the verse. So, and so what I realized, in fact, is that, sorry, this is, I have to move this picture here, that the two drawings were in fact part of a single sheet, which is quite exciting. So at some point during the collecting history, and perhaps quite early in its collecting history, because both sheets carry a Beatty and Taldi collector mark, these drawings were cut in two, so that to have two drawings to put on the market, essentially. And you can see in the picture on the left-hand side how Raphael has a sort of fixed one of the two images again in metal point, in a blind stylus. I've went over with penned ink, and as very much a way of fixing, of placing the figure on the piece of paper. Is perhaps working from a mannequin, but he's possibly also just trying to place the figure so that to sort of not waste paper, because then he knows he will turn the paper 90 degrees and draw the other composition. We can be confident, in stating that, he started with these. So with the sheet in portrait format, and as it was customary, it was good practice to understand the body first without drapery, so you understand the anatomy, the movement, and then you dress the figure. And obviously what this tells us is that, we already, we felt, we knew the drawings were very closely, very close chronologically, but what this archaeological reconstruction does, is just to give you a sense of the sort of the speed with which Raphael's thoughts must have evolved. You really feel that both compositions were born from the same drawing session. But most importantly, I just can't move the PowerPoint. I don't know why. See whether I can do it here. Yes. So this is just an image which is very useful, in fact, just in case someone doubts, whether or not the drawing were once one. It just shows the two images, that once you combine the two pieces of paper, the chain lines actually are continuous, correspondent. This is exactly you know, how those images, the work that our paper conservation department has done, how it can become very useful. In fact, what we're probably looking at is half of a sort of royal format. So you can rebuild sort of the paper format by looking at the size of the chain lines, the position of the watermarks, and so on. But most importantly, we can make much more sense of the verso. I'm not going to comment too much on these drawings because we get too scholarly otherwise, and they're quite difficult to read. I shall just say that you see this arch running on Parker 517, which on its own made absolutely no sense, but now we can actually see that it's a continuation of this arch, which belongs to this perspectival view of an interior of a church, perhaps an evocation of one of Francesco di Giorgio Mattini's buildings in Cortona. And here there are memories of, again, Francesco di Giorgio Mattini's San Bernardino in Urbino. And so it's not clear whether Raphael is a sort of recalling from memory these buildings while he's in Florence, or is, as I think, more likely sort of reusing a piece of paper that he must have had must have brought with him back from one of his visits in Urbino. But this is exactly where you see a better understanding of paper, a better understanding of his watermarks would really help contribute to the art historical discourse. I will now move on to last topic, which is something that is really fascinated me and it continues to fascinate me and surprises me every time I look at Raphael's drawings. And so I will do so with two drawings. The first here at the Ashmolean Museum. One of my favorite drawings in the collection is Study for the Coronation of the Virgin, study in pen and ink, full of underdrawing in blind stylus. I've just highlighted here a delightful angel, who's sitting on steps of this throne. So this is not blank, and there's possibly perhaps another one here. There are a few marks that could perhaps indicate a second angel. And what this drawing is, I mean, this drawing has always been discussed in relation to a commission which Raphael received in 1505 for the Monteluce altarpiece, a commission where we have the document, and the nuns ask Raphael to make a painting, an altarpiece for the church of this monastery, which is in fact, as was customary, had to imitate, had to recall the earlier, very prestigious model, which is the Ghirlandaio's Coronation at Nani from the 1480s. And I'm not sure this is necessarily a preparatory drawing for that painting, but if it is, as everyone believes, one has to acknowledge that Raphael is very much breaking the terms of the contract in a way, because he's trying to do something completely new. He's First, he's sort of introducing, if you take the Virgin and Christ on its own, that's rather traditional, but it's the context, is what he does with this incredible monumental architectural throne. He is really opening up the road for the next generation of artists, for the so-called Mannerist period where he's now appropriated the antique and plays with vocabulary. And so this beautiful volute here seems to very much perform a function, is sort of supporting what's above, and then here it sort of he transforms it in a decorative element. But the most the most extraordinary, the most significant, I think, aspect of this drawing, which I believe had gone unnoticed before, is its relationship with the Pala di Pesaro by Giovanni Bellini. Scholars have tried, I mean, Pesaro was just a few minutes away from Urbino, and Giovanni Santi, Raphael's father, who was a painter, a courtier himself, had a great admiration for Giovanni Bellini. So Raphael must have known this painting as a child, and scholars have tried to sort of understand the meaning and the influence of this painting in Raphael art with comparisons which I think were not convincingly enough, and this comparison instead seems to very much fill this gap. And this is an iconic, you know, if you're not familiar with the painting, this is very much an iconic painting. It's a painting that you study, you know, we study at school, in secondary school. It's a textbook painting, because Bellini is doing, as work of his maturity, Bellini is doing something new here, is sort of giving a terrestrial, as earthly vest to a celestial moment. The coronation is essentially the culmination of the Assumption of the Virgin, and is giving to the theme a sort of classical vest, again with this beautiful throne, which in itself, you know, this has rightly deserved pages and pages of ink. And Raphael captures the very meaning of this painting. And this is a characteristic of Raphael's drawings, Raphael art, generally speaking, this ability to, again, imbue religious iconographies with human values. It's a constant, a leitmotif of his career, and I wonder whether what's the meaning? If to me, if this is really a drawing made in relation to the painting, then Raphael is perhaps trying to convince the Monteluce nuns to accept a more modern design. You can see this much more modern design compared to what the patrons wanted, by recalling what an equally important and equally prestigious model, in this case the Pala Pesaro di Bellini. So it's very much the question of the auctoritas, of the authority of the model of the past. It's only an idea which I cannot prove, of course. I will finish with one very last drawing, which is not a drawing that belongs to the Ashmolean collection, but it was part of our exhibition of 2017. And I'd like to very briefly talk about this drawing, just because I think it's emblematic of what we, it just touches all these points I've addressed in the last half an hour. This is, as you can see, a beautiful drawing, pen and ink, a reflection upon the Transfiguration, very much in homage to Leonardo da Vinci, around 1508. Perhaps just before going to Rome, or he's just arrived in Rome. And if you start looking very, very closely, you will see again an underdrawing in lead point. There is plenty of lead point, is a sort of metal point again, which leaves a grey mark, so a visible mark. Is very soft. It's a graphic, it's a graphite-like mark, and the impression is that is as he does, sort of loosening up his hand, his mind is just trying to place the figures, the architecture, and so on. So what I will show you now is an infrared reflectography, which pulls out this underdrawing very, very, very beautifully. And you can clearly see that actually there is something more going on. The Raphael, I'll go back and then forward. So you can see that essentially here there is no bay at the back. So the arch ends quite funnily on the head of this apostle. But actually in the underdrawing, he'd conceived another arch. This is the capital, and a further bay in the center in going up, towards the back. So essentially, this is the plan. You have a rectangular room with 6 bays, and this is there is a door. There seems to be a door here, and just the apostles are sitting here. So this is how he's imagining the apostles. Now, this is, I've argued that this is actually not just a architecture, but a very, very, very important architecture, that Raphael is doing something, is being very learned, very, very clever. He's quoting, I've argued, a very prestigious architecture, the very room where the Last Supper was thought to have taken place in Jerusalem, on the Mount Zion. You can see here in this plan that it is exactly a rectangular room divided in 6 bays, as Raphael is drawing. And this case seems to echo very much Giorgio Vasari's words when he described Raphael as a great storyteller, that his stories echo the writings, and actually the sites and the buildings look exactly as they are described. And there were many sources Raphael could have gone back to. Pilgrims were coming back from Jerusalem with written descriptions, with drawings, but, and this is something very fun, actually there was a particular site, Sacro Monte. For those who are not familiar with the Sacro Monte, there were essentially sites built for pilgrims, so that they rebuilt exactly Jerusalem as it was. So pilgrims could sort of undertake the pilgrim without having to it was quite dangerous to go to Jerusalem, so you could do it in Italy by sort of going. They were usually high up, so you had this feeling of you had sort of the how to say, you could experience the actual journey. There was one site in particular that was being built in Tuscany, the Sacro Monte di Vivaldo, also known as La Nuova Gerusalemme, which it was a site, is recognized as the site that more than any other that sort of proliferated actually in the 16th century, very closely imitated Jerusalem. And many patrons in Florence were involved, were financing the construction of these sites. So it is very possible that, it's an hypothesis of course, but it is very possible that Raphael knew the site and the drawings and used these as a source. So I will stop here, and I hope I've sort of illustrated how, as I said more than once, this very careful and sort of painstaking attention to detail how rewarding can be, and how can really contribute to enrich our understanding of Raphael as a draftsman, still now after nearly 200 years of scholarship. So thank you for listening.
Well, thank you very much, Angelamaria. That was absolutely fascinating. I really enjoyed it. We can have some questions through the chat if people would like to type in something, but I don't see anything there yet. So I was wondering if I could begin by asking you a question. I was fascinated by what you were saying about materials, and particularly there's a contemporary Chinese ink painter who's fascinated by old masters, both from 14th century China and the Renaissance, particularly Raphael. And he's very, very exacting about the handmade paper that he commissions, and will happily reject it when he tries it with the brush. It's not good enough. Do we have any records or information about how artists chose materials, or whether they rejected them, or how they were supplied? I think particular papers, I suppose, but any of them.
I think, I mean, the evidence is primarily visual in a way. So you have drawings in themselves are documents in a way, and so you're talking about paper in particular, or about materials? Sorry, Sheila.
Well, about paper particularly, yes.
This is a very good question. Sorry, paper in particular. Not for Raphael. No. This is precisely the point I was making. I mean, there has been quite a lot of work done for Michelangelo, for example. A colleague of mine, Mario Mussolini, has, sort of archaeological reconstruction I've done for the Cardellino. He's working on a lot, and he's looked at the paper very closely, and he has some ideas of how Michelangelo used paper, what paper he liked, and so on. But not specifically for Raphael. Generally speaking, this was paper though that was available at the time. It wasn't. So Michelangelo often uses rough paper as well, so cheaper paper. It looks like the Raphael used quite nicely handmade paper. Again, this is the limited evidence I can give you from having analyzed, a small group of drawings out of over 400. But it is indeed a very interesting question, and this is why, likely for us, younger generation, there is still loads to do. We've got things to do, so something in the future certainly to explore.
It's fascinating to hear.
Not written evidence, for example, in terms of written evidence, is highly frustrating for Raphael. We have very, I mean, those the sheet with sonnets that I've showed you, it's one of the very few examples. We've got 5 letters, I can remember, 5 sonnets, very, very little evidence, and certainly not mention of paper in any of them. There's a letter by Michelangelo in which he complains about the fact that he doesn't have any paper left that he can draw on, which is fascinating. Nothing of that on Raphael. So very, very difficult for us.
Frustrating. Great. I just look at the chat. I don't see any more questions. Would anyone else have any more comments or anything to put to Angelamaria? There are lots of thanks coming in. Lots of people saying how absolutely it was. And it really was. And
did I understand? Okay. Did I understand correctly that there is a sort of a hierarchy between blind drawings and visible one? A hierarchy suggests a sort of importance. I wouldn't say it's importance. It's just you can say that one comes before than the other. There's a sort of question of time, but not importance. Is there a hierarchy? Sorry, I'm just an interesting question. Perhaps there is a hierarchy in that what it's under there and is visible to the artist, but not to us today, helped him in the process of thinking, of creating. So in this sense, yes, it is important. If this is your question, if we could see each other, it would be so much easier. I think very often, with blind stylists, it's a point I didn't make. I think so. There are always questions about creative process and so on, but there are also practical questions. Okay, and metal point was also a blind stylist was also a way of not wasting paper, because metal point was discreet, with, you could draw over it, and there was not visual confusion. It was very economical in a way. And it is interesting, for example, I've been working a lot on 17th century drawings lately, and it's very interesting to see that blind stylus already in the second half of the 16th century appears less and less, because paper becomes more available, the sort of creative process becomes more free. And I think it is, but mostly I think it's got to do with paper availability. And so there is, yes, a hierarchical element, there is also a practical element, as always in art history.
Great. So I think that's all about the questions. Yeah, that's great. Well, everybody's saying thank you, and thank you very much. It's wonderful to see how the research from the Raphael exhibition here has been taken forward. So I'd like to think on behalf of all of us, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much for listening. Thank you. Thank you. Bye.